that we all have a little bit of stubborn in us. Am I right? Okay, good. You're nodding your heads. Um, as children, or those of you who have children yet, you're probably thinking to yourself, yeah, they're stubborn. As a child, I know that my parents would often have to say to me, go do your chores, clean this up, take care of this. And I would wait, inevitably, I would wait for this thing to happen. Maybe you're familiar with this. And the parents start with this 1, 2, 2.5, before I actually do what they ask me to do. I'm waiting for those numbers because I'm stubborn and I have a bit of an attitude, maybe. What about as a teenager? As a teenager, none of you were stubborn, right? Yeah. I think it's more like when you're a teenager, your parents warned you not to do something, like, you shouldn't do this, or this is a bad choice. And yet, what inevitably happens? The kids are like, yeah, right, whatever. And then they go off and they do it anyway. We have to learn from our own mistakes, I think. Or as an adult, now maybe I should just ask. As adults, you guys have gotten more mature and less stubborn, right? No. Maybe I should ask it this way. How many of you, when you're at work, like it when somebody else tells you this is how you should do your job? No. All of a sudden you get stubborn and say, no, I know how to do my job, thank you very much, back off. We kind of get set in our ways. Maybe we get stubborn. Maybe we don't like to listen, whatever it is, but we become resistant. But there's a major difference between being stubborn and resistant and a choice to reject authority. In fact, a choice to what I'm going to talk about today, something along the lines of being resistant. In the story today, it's one of these we celebrate. It's the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. And we tell that to the kids, and we love sharing that story with the kids because God showed up in the fiery furnace and God saved them, right? God shows up and it's a story of victory. But then there's this other part where God celebrates the fact that they're faithful. He says, you didn't bow down to this idol. And so we celebrate that and we tell our kids, you should know, not to do these things that are bad. And you should celebrate that God's going to be with you in the fiery furnace. But, we don't often turn to our kids and tell them, you should learn this other lesson. When they stand up against the king and they rebelled, they were disobedient to the authority above them. We don't like to teach our kids that part, right? And yet, that's kind of what's taking place in here. It's kind of, these Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are disobedient to the authority put over them. We've been digging into the stories of exile. We've been digging into the major prophets and looking at what it feels like to live in a society of exile, in a community where we are outside the norm and, in fact, we have to live under the rule of others. Last week we talked about what does it feel like to live in ruins when our whole world is destroyed, and even metaphorically, what does it feel like when the things around us are falling apart? This week, I'm asking the question, what do we do when our values come into conflict with those above us? What's the right and appropriate Christian response when we find ourselves in conflict with management at work or within a family scenario, or even when there's rules and authorities in the world around us that would tell us to do something that is against our moral values? Now, let me clarify. This is not intended to be a political sermon, and hopefully you're going to listen very closely and know that this applies much deeper. I've known people who, at work, they've been asked to hide money or filter it a different way so that it wasn't seen a certain way. I've known people who, in family situations, have been asked to maybe cover up for a sibling or someone so that something is not discovered. I've known people in social environments that have been asked to give special treatment. What do we do when we find our values are in conflict with the world around us? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refused to worship an idol. And the result, of course, was the king was furious. The king said, if you won't do this, you're going to be thrown in this fiery furnace. You're going to die. And he was very angry about it and said, this is what's going to happen. And I want to clarify, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were exiles. They were taken from Israel, and they were planted in Babylon. But they were also advisors to the king. They were ones who were there with some measure of power and authority, responsibility. They were treated very nicely. They had great food. Except now they're disobeying the king. And the king says, not only am I going to strip everything from you, and you are going to lose everything you have, but on top of that, I'm going to throw you in this fiery furnace. And I think to myself, why would somebody choose that? When you've got things going for you, when things maybe at work are just going really smoothly and everything's going great, why would you choose to disobey someone in authority? Of course, we find their reasoning. They believed absolutely that God's law had more authority in their life than the king did. And as they said to the king, they were willing to be held accountable for their actions. You know, history is filled with people who lived lives that would point out injustice. People who, maybe this phrase has come about more recently, but we're familiar with the phrase of passive resistance or civil disobedience or even nonviolent resistance. Henry David Thoreau wrote in an essay, Civil Disobedience. He said that civil laws are not always just and that humans have an obligation to obey a higher law, and that is their sense of morality. Henry David Thoreau actually went to jail because he refused to pay a poll tax that was to go to support the Mexican War because he thought that was unjust and wrong. He stood up for what was right even though he knew that there would be consequences. Mahatma Gandhi, of course, you're familiar with the struggle in India for freedom and for self-rule, and he promoted hunger strikes. He promoted campaigning for the untouchables and for bringing together Muslims and Hindus, and yet he had to go about it against the government's authority. Martin Luther King Jr., I'm sure you're familiar with, and his challenging of segregation in public facilities, the fact that he actually raises up civil rights supporters for sit-ins and other things. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, he talks about civil disobedience to draw attention to things that are unjust. Bonhoeffer, how many of you know Bonhoeffer? Good. German theologian during the Nazi regime, and he struggled with his own faith to know what is right and what is good in this kind of scenario. How do you stand up to a government in this situation? He says the ultimate question for a responsible man to ask is not how to extricate himself heroically from a situation, but how the coming generation shall continue to live. He doesn't justify his actions. In fact, he knows that he will be held accountable for his actions, but he also knows that to do the right and the good, someone needs to intervene and point out, draw attention to the evil. How do we function in a society that is not the kingdom of God? How is it that we go about, whether it's in our community or our world, our nation, or at work or family, when the system is not the same? And in some environments or situations, we might be asked or challenged to do something that is against our own moral fiber. How do we make choices that would guide and direct us? Well, interestingly enough, this last week at small group on Sunday nights, we're in 1 Peter, and we dug into 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13 through 15, and if you've got your Bible apps open, your events, you'll find that that's listed in there also. And it says this, it says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to the governor as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For it is the will of God that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people." So here we have two things that seem to be contradictory. You have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego choosing to stand up against King Nebuchadnezzar. And then you have Peter telling the people to be still and actually obey the leadership. Now, to put in context, you need to also understand that both communities are living under foreign rule. The Romans are in authority. However, what's taking place in Peter is different. Instead of people supporting the government, instead of people who are actually participating in government and involved and actually advisors, we have people who are zealots, who are in the era of 70 AD, rising up and trying to bring back independence to Jerusalem. Even though they had freedom to worship, they had freedom to honor their God and do all these things, they were not being asked to do anything that was against their religious beliefs, but they were resisting and they were rioting and they were rebelling. I want to point out again, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were full supporters of the government, full supporters of Rome, of Nebuchadnezzar. And they gave advice and wisdom, and they were participatory, except for when he asked them to go against their fundamental beliefs. I think the challenge that I get out of this, all of this, is how do we respond? How do we make a choice of when to be supportive and encouraging, when to be an advisor and involved and engaged in, whether it's the political system or whether it's at work or at home, or you name the scenario. And then how do we decide when all of a sudden we need to choose to remove ourselves, to choose passive resistance? How do we make that choice? And I think if we follow Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's example, we find that we are always supposed to follow the authority that God has placed over us until that authority tells us to do something other than what God would tell us to do. Maybe I should ask it this way. Are there things in your life or in your career or your family that you feel like the world imposes on you, or society demands, or work requires, or culture dictates to you that is against your moral fiber? Is there something that you just comply to because you feel like that's the expectation, but yet there's something inside of you that says that's wrong? I think these are the questions that we need to ask. And then we need to ask ourselves, how can we be both a leader and civilly disobedient? How can we be the one who stands up for that which is right and good and just? Can we maybe address the authorities in our life the same way that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did? Can we turn to them and use the same verse, but maybe change the words slightly so it says, "O world," or "O whoever is in authority, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Our God is able to deliver us. But if not, O authority, we will suffer your persecution. We will do this in order to do what is good, even if it is hard, to do what is right, even if you say it is wrong." I don't know what your challenge is this week. I don't know if there's anything specific that you are struggling with or feel is imposed upon you that is against your moral fiber. But I would tell you, as we see from the example of those living in exile, those living under foreign rule, we're called to do two things: be involved, be supportive, be advisors, be engaged in that system, but then always know when to stand for what is right. It's a challenge, I think, that is left in the hands of each of us. Would you pray with me?